Hello everyone, welcome to Lord Pog Gaming, and I'm your humble host, Lord Pog. I'm honored as you join me once more for yet another of my mad ramblings, as I gear up for what I like to call my Psychology in Gaming series. I had originally wanted to finish my R&R, which stands for Retro Review, on the final game in a series I've been working on. That series of R&R being the best 4 RPGs ever released on the Sega Genesis. And as I said before, I'm on the final review of that, and you're welcome to watch the first 3 installments, if and it tickle your fancy. I'll leave a card for that here, should you want to watch it. And for you Golden Wonders out there who have been following that series, I swear I'll finish it.
You liar!
With that said, it's important to note that while I was working on said video, I came across a particularly interesting game recently. A game that has overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam and has been popping up on my suggested videos on YouTube. The game I'm speaking of is Mouthwashing. And so I gave it a try, and
Emotional damage!
I can't ignore it. I haven't watched anyone else's take on it yet, and I'm surprised Wendigoon hasn't made a video on it.
That's not a stab at Michael.
And I mean that with all respect. After playing Mouthwashing, I couldn't shut my brain off, and had to make this video.
Look, I made you some content. Daddy made you your favorite open wide.
Before we get into all that, first let me do my shameless sales pitch for the channel. If you're new to the channel, and I get you feeling a type of way, you'd honor me by subscribing.
You're a daisy if you do.
And regardless if you're a new or a longtime viewer of the channel, every like and share I get means the world to me. Seriously, y'all can't even begin to imagine how accomplished I feel by the support. While you're here, sign my guest book, that being my comments, and ring my bell for notifications. Okay? That's all I'm gonna say. I won't harp on it any longer.
Well, I don't like to harp on a subject,
I don't
but
care. It comes with me, never have. That's why they call me gregarious.
Let's get on with the show. Before we go head first down the rabbit hole, let's talk about Mouthwashing as a game. First released September 2024, it was developed by WrongOrgan and published by Critical Reflex. It's a first-person amalgamation of genres. It's a puzzle game, a walking simulator, survival horror, but mostly, at its core, Mouthwashing is a narrative interactive novel. Mouthwashing ties into a previous game by WrongOrgan called How Fish is Made, also released in 2024, which was used to low-key introduce Mouthwashing, featuring a demo for Mouthwashing, and in the DLC, the last one and then another, there's even an introduction of Curly, who is the captain of the Tulpar in Mouthwashing. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. What's important to remember is that How Fish is Made is canon to Mouthwashing, and so we'll be diving into How Fish is Made a little later on.
hold your horses.
To give some context of what to expect, if should any of you Golden Wonders out there choose to play Mouthwashing, the developers took heavy inspiration from some of the best movies
I love movies!
out there, including Event Horizon, The Thing, Sunshine, and more. The art and narrative designer, Joanna Kursernen, and I am sure I'm butchering that, and I'm really sorry if I am, in an interview with Rolling Stone,
On the cover of the Rolling Stone!
magazine, saying that she purposely gave the game a retro PlayStation 1 vibe, which serves to give Mouthwashing the look and feel of games like the first Resident Evil, for example. as she claimed that she was given the idea to do that by indie developer Puppet Combo. Mouthwashing has been a huge success since launch, earning Steam's highest ratings in a matter of weeks. Bloody Disgusting gave Mouthwashing a 4 out of 5, and Metacritic gave it an 85 out of 100, with OpenCritic giving it a 92% recommendation. Currently, Mouthwashing is $11.69 on Steam, which isn't honestly a bad price and took me approximately about 3 hours to finish. I suggest finding any way you can to play it, as I personally enjoyed it myself. Be warned though, this isn't a game that lets one just shut their brain off. The story it weaves is one of deep contemplation, if one is capable of enduring such inner monologue. It is the very reason we are here today, as I want to propose a question to you Golden Wonders. If for every action there is then an equal and opposite reaction, then does the idea of lying about our responsibility in the equation serve as proper excuse? What if the universe is shaped exactly like the Earth, meaning up or down, left or right? If we go far enough forward, we end up exactly as we were? I feel now is the time to give a proper spoiler warning here, since the topic at hand will require me to go beat for beat of Mouthwashing's plot. For any of you Golden Wonders out there who'd rather play Mouthwashing than listen to my pseudo-intellectual take on the game, I completely understand, and you'll always be welcome back to watch the video later.
Go away!
For those of y'all who decided to stay, buckle up because we're going for a ride. It's important right now to establish that Mouthwashing's story is not a linear one, but instead chooses to jump back and forth through time. This, at first, could make the game hard to follow, but it's actually one of my favorite ways of storytelling, so I felt pretty secure with it. Not to brag or anything, even though I kinda am.
Boo this man!
Moving along then, my reason for explaining this is because I don't plan on going through the game in this fashion. In an explanation like this, it really would serve no purpose as it only lends itself to the actual gameplay and not an analysis. Explaining this helps me to begin this analysis not at the actual beginning, but the beginning of the actual conflict of the game. As the player sees the aftermath of the cargo ship, the Tulpar, having been wrecked into a foreign object in space. Yes, Mouthwashing takes place in the vast reaches of space. According to the rest of the crew, it was the Tulpar's captain, Curly, who doomed the vessel.
This is a bummer, man.
This perceived mental break in Curly's psyche leaves the other 4 crew members floating in dead space. These crew members are Anya, she's the resident doctor and pseudo-psychiatrist, Swansea, the burly stereotype mechanic, along with Daisuke, a last-minute intern who's to shadow Swansea. And I know I'm probably butchering some of those names, but the game doesn't actually have voice acting to it. You have to read it, and that's how I interpreted it. So bear with me here. Lastly, there's co-pilot and second-in-command Jimmy, whose POV will largely drive the narrative of the game. As it becomes more important, I'll talk more about Anya, Swansea, and Daisuke, but for now, I want to talk about Jimmy and Curly. Curly's seemingly mental breakdown, as diagnosed by Anya, has put Jimmy in the unfavorable position of becoming captain of the slowly decaying Tulpar. What caused Curly to snap is not immediately evident at the start, only that after the crash, he's still alive, but in bad shape. Curly's appearance serves as a subconscious metaphor for the state of the ship. He's bandaged up as it appears he suffered third-degree burns all over his body. Curly can't even give himself his own painkillers, as he's been so badly hurt that it rests upon Anya to take care of him. With Curly so incapacitated, the players get to follow Jimmy, as he, from the start, presents himself with an air of confidence, saying that everything will be alright and no matter what, they'll find a way to survive. We as players have no reason to question Jimmy's hubris, since Anya seems to be as confident in Jimmy. Daisuke, for his part, appears to be relaxed as well about the matter, while Swansea wants to not only question Jimmy's leadership, but also Jimmy's plan on getting them out of there. From the very start, we see Freud's three aspects being presented here: the id, ego, and superego. The most prominent one here is the ego, but not to worry, we'll tackle the other two later. The waters would become way too muddy to try and tackle all three at once, in one section.
That is why I won't do 2 shows a night anymore, babe. I won't.
Keep the id and superego in the back of your minds for now, though, as we'll jump back here soon enough. The definition of ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance, lending itself to the word egotistical, which means excessively conceited or absorbed in one's own self, or self-centered. Then there's the word egocentric, whose definition is thinking only of oneself, without regard for the feelings or desires of others. Again, self-centered. Yet to listen to Freud, his definition of the ego is: the ego represents what may be called reason and common sense, in contrast to the id, which contains the passions. After reading these definitions on the ego and what the general population believes it to mean, only to see how Freud interpreted it, I was at a disconnect until I thought about Carl Jung. Not to say Jung is better than Freud, or vice versa. That's a debate that spans longer than I've been alive, to be sure. What I did was combining these two trains of thought, Jung and Freud, did that then dare take me to the very precipice of deeper consciousness, daring me to jump.
Do you really want to jump? Do you want to?
Knowing that if I did, I was agreeing to an undertaking that I, at the time of this recording, am still uncertain that I've done it any justice.
And here we go.
Jung believed that the ego was a more metaphysical trait, which could be argued that perhaps so did Freud. However, Jung saw the ego more as a bridge between the inner world of oneself to the outer world of consciousness, acting as a sort of heavenly body for one's own inner self that puts order to thoughts, feelings, and sensations. Freud looked at the ego as more of a three-bodied problem, while Jung determined it as the center of one's inner universe. Which is to be believed? Both, if one can subscribe to the idea of the physical and metaphysical. It makes itself evident, whether it be by accident or the human condition by the developers of Mouthwashing. Jimmy's hubris is directly linked to his ego. As Jung put it, an inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. It is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of understanding the contemporary events, and incapable of drawing right conclusions about the future. It is hypnotized by itself, and therefore cannot be argued with. It inevitably dooms itself to calamities that must strike it dead. Jimmy from the very start hatches a plan that is to Swansea a big no-no. The Tuplar is a cargo vessel working for a shipping company called the Pony Express. Not the most original name, But I mean,
it's alright.
it doesn't ruin the game or anything. One of the biggest no-nos for the Pony Express is never touch the cargo, but Jimmy decides to do just that. In the way it's presented, the cargo could be something vital to the crew's survival, and so despite Swansea's pushback, Jimmy goes ahead and loots the cargo with the full support of both Anya and Daisuke. A very interesting conversation between Jimmy and Swansea takes place just before opening the cargo bay, where Swansea mentions that he's not letting anyone into his maintenance room, or utility room as they call it, while also speaking to Jimmy as if he's still Curly's inferior, which in turn forces Jimmy to pull rank and remind Swansea who's in charge now. An understandable position to take on Jimmy's part, as he says that he's the captain now and that he's not going to keep having this argument with Swansea. So where does the ego come into play with all this?
So glad you asked.
As human beings, our egos are our outside manifestation of any given situation. With Freud, it's our way of planning so that we may achieve our goals in a rational manner, while Jung says that it is the very essence of who we are, and it's a tool that we deploy in order to communicate our inner selves to the outside world. Because Freud has the ego placed between the id and the superego, that makes it the center, while as Jung calls it the center of one's personality, meaning that for us as people, the ego plays a big role in our lives, no matter how you look at it. It's what we use to communicate our inner thoughts with, a persona, as it were, and how we want to be perceived by the ego of others. Jimmy is using a lot of ego to enforce his new position as captain. His outward persona, that which he is deploying, is attempting to sound confident while demanding respect. The average person does something similar in nature when finding themselves in positions of power, and or when they become the one everyone around them is coming to for answers and solutions. We see this a lot in men in particular. Not to single out any of you golden wonders out there, but it's almost become a cliche by societal standards. Men are to appear strong and capable at all times, never breaking and forget about crime. To which I agree to a degree. A man should do, but not to their detriment. Jimmy right away is expressing some of this detriment by not heeding any of Swansea's advice on not looting the cargo. Hence why the way psychology views ego and the English definitions of ego are so closely related, even when they don't overtly seem so. Formulating a plan, then carrying out that plan is part of the ego. What the ego's job is to do said tasks in a calculated way within the guidelines of reason, which should lead to a satisfactory conclusion, and that is exactly what Jimmy is doing, but where he's already become caught up in his own hubris is the idea that should he succeed and save the crew, get the Tulpar up and running, and prove to be an all-around competent captain, then he will be feeding the id, meaning he's approaching the situation from a very egotistical standpoint, and doing so from the very start. The idea that they are all in an extremely bad situation, and he's acting so flippant about the matter, shows that in the end, his ego is solely functioning on arrogance and not advancing within the parameters of rationality. Grandiose is defined as impressive and imposing in appearance or style, especially pretentiously so. Which is why, even though Jimmy should be using the bridge of ego to calculate his approach in reasonable fashion, he's already demonstrated why the ego is the weakest of Freud's three aspects, and why to Jung it's something to eventually be overcome. Whether or not the game developers meant to exhibit this or not, who can say? It's a part of the human condition and something that we as people are predisposed to despite our intentions. Arthur Schopenhauer, who is the godfather of this kind of psychiatry used by Freud and Jung, once used Napoleon as an example of the ego, saying Napoleon was possessed by the very ordinary egoism that seeks its welfare at the expense of others. The ego is, in fact, our weakest link. It can be swayed one way or the other, depending upon our desires. The weakest of these egos are evident in those who allow others to guide their opinion, out of a sense of not wanting to cause discourse.
For the people all said, sit down, you're rocking the boat.
Yet while an ego can become abused if all the ego is used for is logical outcome, while denying the natural compassion that associates with emotion,
That is the most illogical attitude.
Schopenhauer believed in a balance, allowing the ego to feed desire when needed, but only in a thoughtful way, cutting it off lest it become too gluttonous. Jimmy on the surface appears to be using the ego in calculation, yet we soon learn that had he listened to Swansea, not just to those who are feeding his ego, then he wouldn't have introduced the one element that, while appearing minuscule at first, is truly the catalyst of the Tulpar's downfall. But then again, Jimmy was never intending to be calculated to begin with. Sigmund Freud believed that the id begins at birth. It's tied to human desire, and it's what people use to inwardly express those desires. Much like Schopenhauer's will to live, which we will get back to. The id is neither good nor evil, only that it wants what it wants. As an infant, we outwardly puppet ourselves for the id, even to our own detriment. It's not until human beings grow in stature and knowledge that we begin to formulate our ego that then becomes the mouthpiece for the id, working in tandem with the id and expressing its needs through the ego to find a way to safely have those needs met. Where the issue there then in lies is that the id is the elder of the ego, having been an entity from birth, meaning it's stronger than the ego, and hence can control the ego almost at will. Should the id not be exercised and honed to such a degree, its dynamic with the ego mimics that of a bad parent raising a child in the guidelines of carnality, and not beneficial mental stability. Another way of looking at it is the idea that children have weak egos, but their id are at their peaks of power. Despite the parent having had time to develop their ego in positive direction, they can become overpowered by their progeny's id, to which the parent's ego yields, all for the sake of being their child's friend and not their parent. This can happen internally as well, as people will often yield their ego to their id to gain some sense of satisfaction, believing this brings them inward peace and or balance. Because the id is the stronger of the two, the ego, who's supposed to be in the driver's seat, ends up hearkening to the id that is what some would term a backseat driver now. Or, as Freud put it, one might compare the relation of the ego to the id with that between a rider and a horse. The horse provides the locomotor energy, and the rider has the prerogative of determining the goal and of guiding the movements of his powerful mount towards said goal. But all too often in the relations between the ego and the id, we find a picture of the less ideal situation in which the rider is obliged to guide his horse in the direction in which itself wants to go. All you Golden Wonders out there might be asking about this time, okay, Pog, but what does that have to do with mouthwashing?
Oh, well, allow me to retort.
Jimmy is not being driven by a sense of moral ethics. Rather, his id is the horse taking his ego where it wants to go, while his ego is doing its best to keep them upon the path of desired destination, regardless if said destination is really the place they want to end up at. When Jimmy opens the cargo bay, Anya, who's practically useless. Damn! And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that because she's a woman. No, in fact, her meek nature is probably one of the more fleshed out aesthetics of this game, and there's good reason for it, but we'll get to that in a little bit. As said before though, Anya hopes that whatever cargo the Tolpar is carrying for Pony Express will have food and water and things like that, stuff to keep them alive, sustenance as it were. While Daisuke is in fact hoping that there are parts for him and Swansea to be able to repair the Tolpar with so that they may limp their way home. Daisuke is in fact the most hopeful out of the crew. He masks it by acting as if, despite their dire situation, everything will work out in the end. Again, out of all of them, Swansea is the only one expressing Freud's third aspect, the superego. Eventually, we'll talk more on the superego, but keep that in mind. Swansea is the only one out of the four of them that shows any signs of conscience. What the crew find isn't anything that will help them, but in fact, it is the contrary. All there is in the cargo bay is loads upon loads of mouthwash with high alcohol content, so much so that if enough of it is consumed, it serves as an alcoholic beverage. It seems superfluous at first, until the player witnesses the effect it has upon the crew. Anya is devastated by the development. Daisuke regards it as a joke, but it's the effect upon Swansea that the long-term effects will begin to unfold. And I just realized I've been saying Swansea like two different ways. I've been saying Swansea and Swansea, and I'm not going to be able to help that. So just deal with it. I'm so sorry. As for Jimmy, the id will not let the ego deviate. So on the surface, it seems that he's gonna roll with the punches. He can't afford to let this setback outwardly bother him in a negative way. To do so would prohibit the id's end desire of the situation. And so Jimmy acts as if he's got plans upon plans. He's not gonna let this one bump in the road stop him. He'll figure this out, even if he's not in all actuality formulating any rational goals in which to do so.
This is fine.
This scenario lends itself to another Freud quote about the id and the ego's relationship when he said, "It only too often yields to the temptation to become sycophantic, opportunist, and lying, like a politician who sees the truth but wants to keep his place in popular favor." For Carl Jung, he in turn did not refer to the id as such, but subscribed to the idea of a shadow, or one's shadow self. I did a whole retrospect on comparing the shadow self to the Legend of Zelda, particularly the Ocarina of Time, and when Link faces Dark Link in the Water Temple. Any of you Golden Wonders out there are welcome to watch that. I'll leave a card for it right here, but be warned, I was still pretty new to this whole dango YouTube thing at the time, so that video isn't as polished as this one. Not saying that this video is award worthy either. Still, I should leave a disclaimer about its production, or lack thereof, and y'all can check it out if and you want.
Do it.
To Jung, the id is an individual's shadow self, their darker nature, as it were. That part of all of us that we work to control, but all too often ignore and by proxy deny. The problem with denying one's darkness is that eventually it wants to be heard. Think of a room that has been cleaned, save for one corner that for whatever reason the light of the room doesn't touch, leaving it shrouded in perpetual darkness. As a result, less care is applied to said corner because it's not overtly visible, yet left unattended for too long will result in the things that are disregarded into that dark corner to pile up, inevitably spilling out into the rest of the room and into the light. There are two options that can be taken. Clean what is only visible, i.e., dealing with the consequences of when that which is shackled in the dark breaks free, or face the darkest part of the room and clean it too, accepting that it exists and must be controlled. Professor Jordan Peterson has used the analogy of cleaning one's own room before, in a sense of taking control of one's own life. By physically cleaning one's room, we then are given an example of what control can look like. Just like the id must be controlled, just like the shadow must be controlled. It is this idea of control that is torn away from the crew once the catalyst of the mouthwash enters the picture, especially for Swansea, who up until now has been the voice, albeit abrasive voice, of reason for the group. Now being confronted by his shadow, he gives into his id, taking the mouthwash, mentioning how he's about to give up something like 15 years of sobriety, and begins to get drunk. Not only that, he begins dragging down Daisuke with him, proving that the introduction of the mouthwash not only has long-term devastating effects upon Swansea, but also for Daisuke, which we'll get into a little bit later as well. To Swansea, though, their demise is evident, so he might as well stop trying, opting to adopt his alcoholism instead.
Well, when life gives you lemons.
There's an important lesson to be learned in all of this for us, as people, regardless of the fact that this is a video game set in a futuristic science fiction setting. Had Jimmy set aside his own id's desires, allowing his ego to do its job, then he would have taken Swansea's advice to heart. Swansea may have turned out to be the only one actually pleased by the discovery of the alcoholic mouthwash, but to say he's pleased may be a stretch. Perhaps resigned to his fate would be a better way of looking at it, since it was Swansea who originally was opposed to opening the cargo bay from the start. Now he's the one out of the four of them to have become truly defeated, all because what he advised did not align with Jimmy's schemes of grandeur. King Solomon, who is considered to be the wisest man to have ever lived by some, but at the very least considered to be one of the wisest men in history by others, wrote in the book of Proverbs, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a person who listens to advice is wise. And one who walks with wise people will be wise, but a companion of fools will suffer harm." If we look at Swansea and observe his history, we learn that out of the four of them, he's got the longest history with the company. We're leaving out Curly for now, as what needs to be said regarding him will come later. Anya is a medical student without a degree. As it turns out, the Pony Express cut corners financially by enlisting an uncertified medic. Daisuke is a last-minute addition to the crew, who is as green as grass. He's supposed to intern for Swansea and learn to be a mechanic, but his youthful exuberance conflicts with his better judgment. Daisuke doesn't have all the years of the job on his shoulders like Swansea, and as such has been beaten down by them either. Neither Anya nor Daisuke have a strong enough ego to handle the situation at hand, and so are more like yes men for Jimmy, which feeds Jimmy's id, meaning they are fools whose ids are carried by Jimmy's. Swansea at first is represented as the archetype of the husky, gruff mechanic whose sole purpose is to conflict with the gallant and capable Jimmy. It's this representation that misleads the player about Swansea and his true motives, as it's a natural part of our nature to stay clear of people like that.
I hate rude behavior in a man.
Every one of you working class golden wonders out there have all known a person like this in the workplace. That one co-worker whose whole persona is a ball of negativity. For those of you who aren't working yet, whether it be because you just can't or just aren't of legal age yet, just wait. There's one in every group. Question is, has anyone ever stopped to ask why or what has made this person so negative? I want y'all to hold on to that question for a while, and we'll get back to it later. Truth is, despite Swansea's gruff exterior, he's the only one presenting Jimmy with multiple options. An option B, as it were, that while it only seems to act as contrary to Jimmy's command, it is still a secondary option, even if it does follow the road less traveled. Ideally, the option of checking the cargo is the more logical choice, since there very well could have been useful materials there. Following the Pony Express guidelines of never messing with the cargo, regardless of the situation by all rights, is very communistic. It's not that Jimmy ignores the rules and opens the cargo bay that puts him at fault. It's his reasons for doing so that does. Coupled with the fact that he never bothers to treat Swansea as an elder crewman, heeding his counsel on the matter because, again, there's no glory in it for him if he does. Treating Swansea with a little more dignity and respect that his years of service should have earned, no matter how much of a meanie weenie
Watch your profanity.
he is, would have earned Jimmy an amount of camaraderie with Swansea that even if he still chose to open the cargo bay, he might have been himself able to reason with Swansea, convincing him that if he proceeds to become a drunkard, then he won't be able to rely on him for another solution. Swansea, already having been made to feel more valued, might listen and realize that he needs to assist Jimmy in finding a solution to their dilemma. Maybe not, but the odds would have certainly increased. Instead, Swansea becomes a drunk, which in turn will slowly drag Daisuke down with him. Which, as stated before, could have been avoided if Jimmy were making decisions based upon the right reasons and not the selfish machinations of his id. Because as we'll soon learn, Jimmy is in fact the one person on the Tolpar who's lost the most control of his id. I'm gonna sidetrack us for a minute.
Here we go again.
And instead of jumping right into Freud's third aspect, the superego, I'm gonna use this section to talk about Anya and the survival mechanism of a weak ego. Best way to describe Anya as a character is to talk about Darwin's survival of the fittest. By now, I'm sure it's occurred to all of you Golden Wonders out there that we're in for the long haul, as the phrase goes. For those of you who have stuck it out with me thus far, I'm truly blessed by you, and I can't thank you enough. I mean this with my very heart and soul. I love y'all, and thank you for taking this journey with me.
I promised myself I wouldn't cry.
Survival of the fittest is probably the best lens in observing Anya, as we'll soon learn that she is pregnant. The game, as mentioned before, likes to jump around through time to retell the events of the story, but it also jumps back and forth from two perspectives. There's the main perspective of Jimmy, but at times the player also gets to see things from Captain Curly's, allowing the player to uncover why he crashed the Tulpar in the first place as the game progresses. But we're not quite there yet. It is through Curly that we learn more about Anya, however, since from Jimmy's POV, she's a burden and a cheerleader. Through Curly, we get to see that she's very relatable in the sense where she's been denied the proper training and credentials to do the job she's been assigned. That's not to say she isn't capable. She's had schooling in medicine and psychology, but we learned she wasn't allowed to finish getting her degree. The why is sort of vague, but it's alluded to that it was more cost efficient for the company to go ahead and put her to work, over waiting for her to finish her schooling, and exactly how it's more cost efficient isn't really delved into. Either the company was paying for her schooling and decided they had paid enough, or they hired her despite her lack of degree because then they can get away with paying her less. Corrupt capitalism, am I right? Curly shows Anya, despite all of this, the proper respect she deserves, taking note of the stress her tasks take on her, even acknowledging the lack of respect she receives from Jimmy, his co-pilot. Later on, Curly learns that Anya is pregnant, with Jimmy being the father. She's uncertain now, becoming a nervous mess since Jimmy doesn't seem to reciprocate her concerns. The game works to make who the father is a mystery at first, since Daisuke and Swansea both have characteristics that would make them being the father of Anya's child problematic. Swansea has a family at home already, and Daisuke is pretty much a child with a slacker's attitude. So far, Jimmy, because of the confidence that he exudes, seems to be the only one that would make a possible decent fit. It's this presentation of Jimmy that could be misleading, since the way Anya describes her conversation with the unknown father to Curly makes it appear as if the father is incompetent. At the very least, it gives the air that they could care less. The situation Anya finds herself in now is that she is in fact what some might term as a booty call, and the fact that she is pregnant is her own problem, not the father's. Because the game has worked to pose Jimmy as the hero, it couldn't possibly be him, but anyone paying attention by this point hasn't a shred of doubt in their mind that it's Jimmy. Which now explains why Anya is Jimmy's biggest fan at the start of the game, with her even claiming that he's so smart and capable, even though she's already learned the exact opposite is true. Since Jimmy can't even take responsibility for his child, how then can he take responsibility for keeping them all alive long enough to figure out a solution? No matter how hard Anya tries to encourage Jimmy, he treats her like she's a burden. To an extent she is, but it's unfair to label her as such, since as stated before, she's not a licensed medic. So when she's put in charge of taking care of Curly in his degenerative state, it takes a huge toll on her mentally, which Jimmy could care less about. Instead of support and understanding, he makes her feel as if she were useless. These interactions between the two, Anya being as supportive towards Jimmy as she can be, while Jimmy acts as if a stick of gum has more use than she does, is but one of the more tragic narratives in Mouthwashing.
You're breaking my heart.
If observed from Darwin's survival of the fittest, which means that those who are adaptable to change are those best fitted for survival, we now have a better understanding of Anya's position and why she is the way she is. Survival of the fittest is often misrepresented as only the strongest physically survive, or the smartest of the intellects survive. Thinking about survival of the fittest in these terms often lead to people making excuses for bad behavior. It's okay to take from those weaker than yourself because they are beneath your physical prowess, which is where I tend to disagree with Nietzsche's Uberman, or the idea you're so sophisticated socially and mentally that a type of elite socialism
Rights itself. You supported the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, you honeymooned in the Soviet Union, and
develops mentally, when in fact neither of these are what survival of the fittest is about. But in all reality, they are the farthest thing from its intended theorem. The truth behind survival of the fittest is humankind's natural mechanism for survival and being able to learn and adapt to any given situation should they try.
No. Try not. Do. Or do not. There is no try.
Anya isn't weak for showing Jimmy her support, but is in fact adapting to her surroundings in the most efficient manner available. Neither Swansea or Daisuke express this aspect of the human psyche as much as Anya does, because unless we as players understand this, it's quite easy to misunderstand her as a character. In fact, I'm quite surprised Mouthwashing hasn't gotten more criticism for this by some in the way Anya is depicted on a surface level. The fact that she's able to adapt and recognize what appears to be her strongest option for survival shows just how smart she actually is. Now, it goes without saying that perhaps her strongest option is in herself, to which I wouldn't disagree, but framing it within the idea of chain of command, this thought probably wouldn't even occur to her, since it's procedural to follow the orders of the next in line of command when upon a vessel, whether that vessel be a seafaring one or one out in the vast reaches of space. This is to no fault of her own, since it's a mistake that both Daisuke and Swansea eventually make also. So her need to grow closer to Jimmy is in no way a fault by nature, but a fault of observance. Another example of this is the movie Alien, which is one of the movies the developers WrongOrgan used as inspiration for Mouthwashing. The argument here is Jane Ripley is the main protagonist, and ultimately she relies mostly on herself to survive when the xenomorph starts killing the crew one by one. She ends up as the sole survivor because of her reliance and adaptability to the menace of the xenomorph, which makes one wonder, why didn't Anya do the same thing? The quick answer is, go watch the movie again. Ripley doesn't start out that way, and in fact, it isn't until about midway through the second act that we learn she's the main protagonist. Does she from the start do certain things to ensure the crew's safety? Yes, but so does Anya. Anya is one of the people who's suggesting to check the cargo of the Tolpar, in case there's cargo that will feed them and help them. I know I said that doing so was what ultimately leads to the crew's downfall, but not because it's a bad suggestion, but because Jimmy handles the situation wrong. She also figures out how to restock their medical supplies, like more pain pills for Curly. Anya proves in her own way of being a significant member of the crew, but it's her reliance on Jimmy that proves to be her misstep. Ripley doesn't become the ultimate girl boss, which is a term I normally dread,
I am the law!
when seeing it to describe a woman as characters lately in media. In this case, it's well earned on her part since I'm a huge Jane Ripley fan. But she becomes the hero through chain of command after her superiors are wrecked by the xenomorph, which could have happened for Anya if she had become leader through chain of command, since the makings of a hero are there, but never get the chance to flourish. Instead, she has to rely on the survival of the fittest, adapting to the fact that the one person she wants to care for her cannot get past his own egocentric nature to do so, and as a result, she ends up taking her own life once she realizes that they are all doomed. A chain of events that spells the beginning of the end. And it's all because of Jimmy and his lack of accountability and his denial of the superego. Finally, we've come to the conclusion of analyzing mouthwashing by reaching the third aspect Freud talked about in regards to the human psyche. That is the superego. But before we delve headlong into that, I think it's important to talk about the will to live, since the idea and or philosophy of the will to live plays a role in all of this. Arthur Schopenhauer was a German philosopher born in 1788, but if we're being honest, he's the father of modern psychiatry, or psychoanalysis. The line between philosophy and psychiatry, or psychology, is a thin one, and without him, we wouldn't have Freud, Jung, Nietzsche, Peterson, and many more. He's often known as the father of pessimism, and I'm having a hard time pronouncing that word, pessimism. But personally, I tend to disagree with that title. While yes, his views do sound rather bleak and dour, his stern, stoic presence is good for anyone to adopt when dealing with the human condition. Instead, I view him as a man of means, who was capable of living within perfect balance of his id, ego, and superego. One of the more interesting facts behind the natural world is that nature abhors a vacuum, resulting in no straight lines and no empty spaces. Anything that looks like an endless void upon the Earth's surface is in fact an illusion, a trick as it were, on the human mind. Nature will work to fill any negative space with something. Even a whirlpool sucks in water as a means to try and fill itself. Go outside and dig a hole, then leave it alone for a year. Come back in a year's time, and depending on the width and depth of the aforementioned hole, it may be completely filled in. At the very least, the process of filling it will be apparent, and that is because one way or another, nature will take its toll on the hole and start to try and fill it. Schopenhauer believed that this phenomena was present within every person, a sort of metaphysical hole he termed the will to live. The will to live is neither good nor evil, but is an ever-constant force that drives us all to consume, much in the way of a whirlpool. However, what people try to fill it with is mostly intangible, and thus it's impossible to do so. Unless, put into check, the human condition will cause one to overconsume anything, as what the will to live desires most are those things that help humanity cope with the reality of this reality. Anything from basic needs like sustenance and shelter to desires like adult company. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Time to grow up.
Never mind. It doesn't matter. Point being is an overabundance of anything is not a healthy way to live, physically, mentally, or spiritually, and Schopenhauer dedicated his life to this principle. How does the will to live play into the thought of the superego? Well, if the id represents desire at all costs, and the ego is to meet those desires within a reasonable, safe, and rational way, the superego is there to act as the moral compass for when the ego becomes too weak to deny the id, and there in turn remind the ego that it's more than just the rudder of the ship. Basically, to make a long explanation short,
You're a bit late for that!
the superego acts as the little voice of guilt for when one does what they ought not to do, but does it anyway. It's a sort of inner morality that every person is born with, that I would argue is there from birth, but doesn't gain a voice till later. Some might say that the superego is formed solely on the basis of societal understanding of what is right and wrong. So it can only guide morally what is considered socially right and wrong to the world around the individual. However, the argument of ultimate truths comes into play here, as in despite what society may deem right, doesn't always make it so. There's an old phrase that says, what is right isn't always popular, but what is popular isn't always right. It is believed that Winston Churchill said this, but there's no record of him actually saying it, so do with that what y'all will. He did, however, say, you have enemies. Good. That means you stood up for something, sometime in your life. Which still lends itself to the idea I'm trying to present to you golden wonders out there. And that is, even when all of society states that something is right, that doesn't necessarily make it so. The superego can, and has for many in the past, acted as a way of also questioning what is considered good, which in turn can turn a person into a social outcast. To put it in more gaming terminology, I'm an Advent D&D player. D&D standing for Dungeons & Dragons, in case any of you golden wonders out there didn't know. Within the D&D setting are a race of elves known as the Drow, who are subterranean. Years ago, Arthur R.A. Salvatore began a series of books based upon one particular Drow called Drizzt Do'Urden, and his eventual fall from grace of Drow society. Now, I don't play 5th edition. That's a long topic of discussion all on its own, but suffice it to say, as far as 3.5 edition is concerned, Drow society is a treacherous one, where the more backstabbing and conniving a Drow is, the better, especially if a Drow can be all these things and get away with it. The story of Drizzt is that of a Drow who looks at these social norms and questions their quality, wondering if despite the Drow culture claiming them good, it really is good to be a liar and a cheat and a thief. The fact that R.A. Salvatore wrote this series of books organically means that it's an inherent quality of people to seek the truth about what is truly good. That while yes, part of the superego is designed around culture and the sociology of good, the part of the superego that the people are born with has a form of purity to it that seeks to right the ego's course when the id is moving full steam ahead. Which can truly mean only one thing, that the superego is not just one aspect, but is a duality, with one half being the superego, while the other half is what Carl Jung referred to as the persona, the outward mask of how we present ourselves to the public. Try to look at it in terms of the shadow self and the persona, instead of the id and superego. The shadow is the embodiment of the darkest desires, while the persona deals with how we want people to see us. Meanwhile, the ego remains largely the same, with both Freud and Jung basically carrying out the tasks for both. Whether it be viewed as a rider guiding a horse, as Freud put it, or a bridge to carry these actions from inward desires to outwardly gain, as Jung viewed it, the superego acts as that form of ensuring that any one individual doesn't stray too far to achieve their goals, ensuring that those goals don't come at the price of another, while the persona is more like a muscle that needs to be exercised in order to be honed, lest it be manipulated and false. Yet what happens when the superego is ignored entirely, and the persona is a lie? This is what mouthwashing is about at its very core. The lie one presents to those around them and their self, while neglecting the responsibility of their actions, burying their superego under the weight of their actions, when the id is in control of the ego and the shadow is wearing the mask of the persona. Accountability, guilt, remorse are but footnotes in one's own psyche. To put this into perspective,
too much. There's too much fucking perspective now.
Let's talk about how Mouthwashing ends. Remember when I said we were gonna save talking about Curly last? Well, here we are, finally.
Finally!
At that point, Curly is suffering from mental instability. The DLC of How Fish is Made, the last one and then another, acts as a sort of introduction to Curly, the Tulpar, and Mouthwashing. It presents the idea of choice, and does one even possess free will, or does it even matter? After all, if we are all just sardines in a machine, doesn't that make our existence simple? Such ideas bring us to the beginning of Mouthwashing as we play Curly, sabotaging the Tulpar, so that it will crash into an asteroid.
Yoinks! And away!
Or some such foreign object. We witness through some trippy hallucinations how he's finally cracked, and then we pick up with the rest of the crew deciding what they should do. The crash has left Curly a mutilated husk, conscious of his surroundings, but unable to do anything for himself. Later, by way of flashback, we learn that the reason for Curly's mental breakdown could be tied to the fact that after years of loyal service to the Pony Express, he and the rest of the crew are being let go from their jobs. Up until this indiscretion of trying to crash the ship, Curly is presented as a kind, caring person, with the only mentally unstable thing the player witnesses from his POV is an odd trip walking to the cockpit of the ship, which in of itself is serving as more of a warning for Curly. Jimmy has a similar ordeal showing how the burden of being in charge is taking a toll on him, but it's far more in depth. Seriously, I thought I had accidentally slipped into the labyrinth.
Everything I've done for you. I move the stars for no one.
I half expected Jennifer Connelly to be waiting at the end of those stairs. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, an expression that fits when thinking about Curly. He's the captain of the Tulpar. Everyone and everything is his responsibility. I'm not kidding. The crew can't even access sugar without his authorization, which is by Pony Express's standards and conduct. Working for that company is presented as a nightmare, as even the propaganda in the form of informational posters gives little factoids of what the company expects out of their employees. Things like not exceeding 5 hours of sleep, when the average 8 hours is what is commonly known as beneficial. Workplace accidents and the cost of taking care of them are docked from the employee who is hurt's pay. Anyone can relate to the idea of such a work environment being enough to want to make anyone crack, especially if making sure that the day-to-day operations running smoothly rests entirely upon a single individual's shoulders, no less. In realizing the actual living hell that is Pony Express, this causes the player to feel more akin to Curly and his plight. Even if we can't wholeheartedly agree with him trying to wreck the ship, we should at the very least look inwardly and question what such conditions would do this to us. To top all of that, he's now being fired. Not just him though, but the others as well. And that's where what really has happened unmasks its persona. Through following Curly, we not only get to know him, but we finally get to see past the veil Jimmy has so carefully crafted for himself. Turns out Curly and Jimmy are longtime friends, and that while Curly has nurtured his ego by keeping his id in check, Jimmy has had a troubled past, with the exact details never really being touched on. Or, you know what? We'll say the details aren't exact instead. That just sounds better in my head. I'm sorry. Nope. Jimmy being troubled and becoming co-pilot for Curly is viewed as his final shot at making something of himself, even going as far as building Curly up in his mind, almost idolizing him to unrealistic heights creating a sort of resentment for how well Curly carries himself. So when Curly breaks the news about how this is their last mission, Jimmy takes it to the hardest. He launches into a long rant about how Curly could care less about losing their jobs, since he's the only one with real prospects, even guilting Curly with how Anya doesn't even have a real medical degree. Swansea, there, I did again, is too old and set in his ways to start over, and Daisuke has no real life experience. All that is just a facade of Jimmy's persona, however, as he, in the end, is the one who could really care less about the others. They are just a means to an end to talk about his real beef.
You don't want no beef? You don't want no beef?
And that is himself, and what's going to happen to him. In the end, Jimmy is really only jealous of the respect Curly has earned for himself. His id desiring to be admired like Curly is admired, and Curly, for his part, continues to be the ever-loyal friend by promising Jimmy that he'll help him stay on his feet when they get back home. This isn't enough for Jimmy. His id, his shadow, will not be ignored. Consequences be damned.
Consequences, schmonsequences, as long as I'm rich.
It's through all this the player learns who really crashed the ship, as Curly, in a moment of weakness, allows Jimmy to take control of the Tolpar. It's alluded to that Curly didn't truly know that Jimmy would crash the ship, since after he begins the sequence to do so, Curly acts dumbfounded by this. Yet it is also possible that because Curly has been suffering mentally also, he lied to himself and repressed his superego long enough to allow for a form of self-denial. Either way, the player is now aware that all those moments of mental distortion they thought was from Curly's POV are in fact from Jimmy's, with the exception of the one trippy staircase moment. But that could be excused since it framed it as more of a mental exhaustion and Curly dealing with a lot, since he did keep the company firing everyone a secret for a while, on top of dealing with everyone's personal issues. Not to mention the fact that Pony Express adds more responsibility than what is humane on him. I think it's a little cracking around the edges, and that is understandable. When Curly does finally tell the crew that they are all fired and Jimmy snaps on him, it's during their one allowed birthday party. And oh, don't you worry, Golden Wonders. We're going to be getting to the birthday party shortly. As mentioned, the crash leaves Curly mangled, bloody, and incapable of doing anything. Seriously, he looks like a mummified mound of bloody hamburger meat. Sorry, there was no better way of describing that. But now he's in constant pain, forcing Anya to have to hand feed him his pain medication, only she can't stomach it to do it, leaving the responsibility of doing so on Jimmy, who is now the Tolpar's captain, which is exactly what he wanted. By crashing the ship and injuring Curly, he now has a chance to save the day and become the Golden Boy.
I love gold.
What Jimmy didn't count on was the mental stress a situation like the one he's in can take on someone, which he verbally confirms to Curly while feeding him his pain meds. Honestly, there's not much more to say about Mouthwashing without going through every crazy thing beat for beat, which isn't really needed in order to make the point. I've already spoiled the major reveal, so there's not really any sense ruining much more. I will say, however, that even though I've given the major plot away, I still suggest you Golden Wonders play Mouthwashing, because there's still a lot that it has to offer. At the time of this recording, as said before, it is $11.69, but that's a special promo, so by the time this drops, it's going to be $12 and some change probably. Before closing this out, I do want to cap it all off with 3 more instances that will better exemplify the mistakes of denying one's superego, with the first being the birthday party, as it's a lighthearted moment in the beginning until Curly has to break the bad news to the crew. Later on, Jimmy, who's now actively fighting his superego, tries to recreate the birthday party, without giving too much away because it is a wild scene. It's symbolic of Jimmy beginning to crack under the weight of his id and its demands. If the birthday party represents better times, then the reenactment represents that longing to go back to those times. How through his own actions and denial of his superego, the birthday party Jimmy is trying to create is a bastardization and a reminder, a constant reminder that you can't go back. What is done is done. Also, the cake is a lie. The next example I'm going to use is the tulpar itself, as the word tulpar is actually a name used for a winged horse in Turk mythology. Yes, it's basically a Pegasus. Congratulations, you know Greek mythology.
Check out the big brain on Brad!
Later on, Jimmy has to travel into the cargo bay to retrieve some of the mouthwash, and while doing so, he goes through a mental break. He imagines an invisible beast is chasing him, that when UV light is put on it shows the beast to be a demonic-looking horse. This is important for several reasons. The beast resembling a horse means that WrongOrgan did some research and understood the assignment on why the tulpar should look like a tulpar. 2, because of the way the tulpar is introduced. It's in a note that says something to the effect that the beast is hungry or savage or some such, and that Jimmy can't run from it. This represents how, despite Jimmy's best efforts, the superego is beginning to break through, that he cannot outrun it forever, that no wrong goes unpunished, whether it be by God, man, or thyself. Eventually, we all must face thyself, and we cannot run from it. Lastly, this makes the tulpar as a ship a character of the story, as it shows how Jimmy has sunken so low that he now realizes even the ship is rejecting him and dogs his every step. The last example I want to talk about is Swansea again, and a speech he gives Jimmy. I'm not going to say it verbatim, only what is important. The mouthwash is a symbol of failure for Jimmy and his lack of capability as a leader. How his selfish desire took over his better judgment, which costs him Swansea as an ally, who could have been in the end a great asset to the crew and Jimmy. Instead, when it's all said and done, Swansea tells Jimmy that after everything is said and done, the greatest thing he, being Swansea, ever did was being a drunk, which at face value makes it seem like the message here is that drunk or sober, success or failure, it doesn't matter, because up or down is choice just an illusion. Yet I think there's something to be read between the lines here. Regardless if choice is just an illusion, you are what you are. Swansea is telling Jimmy that he may have been a drunk, but at least his persona and his superego were one and the same. That he didn't hide who he was, not like Jimmy, who practically killed his superego and wore his persona as a lie. Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is really free." Because of Jimmy's lack of contentment, he does not know freedom, since his desire rests upon the perception of others. His id's desire is covetous of who Curly is, to such an extent that it overthrows his ego, stifling his method of reason. But in order to do all this comfortably, he then must bury his superego so that guilt, responsibility, and most importantly, accountability for his actions won't get in the way of what he wants. The shadow won't be denied any longer, so it crosses the bridge of the ego and wears the mask of the persona. Jimmy has come to believe that what he wants most is to be regarded as a hero, so he tries to fill his will to live with schemes that jeopardize everyone around him. Yet the will to live can never be filled, so the more he tries, the worse things become. In all of this, the mouthwash is the symbol of his defeat, and its introduction at the very start, meaning that even at the beginning, Jimmy had already been defeated, since the mouthwash is cargo that doesn't benefit their situation in the slightest, proving that had Jimmy even took the reins as leader with his super ego intact, then perhaps the mouthwash would have been just a setback, but instead it becomes the sword he falls on. Mouthwashing is a cautionary tale for all who play it, relating the message of how one should, like Schopenhauer, become a person who lives within their means, lest we let our id overthrow our ego and lie to ourselves about what our super ego is telling us. For if we do what we ought not to do, then how do we know that what our super ego is telling us isn't in all actuality our shadow self wearing our persona? Then, my golden wonders, that begs the question, what becomes our mouthwash? I want to thank everyone who made it to the end. Seriously, I can't thank you golden wonders enough. It really does make me feel better to know that there are people out there who are willing to listen to these mad banters of mine. Don't forget to like and share the video as it gets my channel out there. And if you're new, go ahead and subscribe as well. Sign my guest book while you're here and ring my bell for notifications. And as always, I want you golden wonders to know that despite whatever our differences in these real world issues might be, whatever our views and however they may vary from one another, when it comes to gaming, we share a common ground that these real world divides can't take away from us. And as a result, from my very heart and soul, I want you to know I love you. I would fight any horde or foe by your side. You're always welcome in my lobby. Y'all come back now. Stay golden.